Thank you for tuning in to Dynamic Art LLC. I'm your host Daniel, and today's episode is part 2 of our Born to Rap class. Today we're going to go into the actual design of what we're going to put on this vehicle, and then in part 3 you're going to see us put it on. Thank you for hanging in there with us. And so before we get into our actual design of our graphic, one of the things that I wanted to kind of show you guys and give you a chance to kind of look at, because we won't have time to do it in part 3 when we actually go into the actual laying out of this rap, is some of the tools and equipment that we're going to use to actually do this particular rap. And so let's get into what some of these things are. Now, as you can see, this was our rolling gift package, which basically is a tool belt for all the stuff that you need when you rap. Now, I did add a couple extra things that I need because as I got into it, I realized these things were important to have. But let's just kind of go through it and point it out. One of the main things that you're going to see here is that it's going to hold these magnets. And these magnets, you can hear that, they stick to anything that's metal. And what that's meant to do is that's going to hold up our graphic as we do it, especially if you're doing it like me as a one-man band. And you need some extra help to hold and align your stuff up. Now, keep in mind, we did learn that in class, if you leave these on too long, that they can leave permanent circle rings in your graphic, and we don't want that to happen, so we're not going to leave them on there for a long time. We're going to use tape as well. One of the other things too is there are a couple of different squeegees that came with this kit, and one's a little softer than the other, and the other one's a little harder. And this is all based on preference when you start to put the graphic on. And as you can see, I'll probably move in between these, and I have a third one that I use as well. Okay? Now, there are a couple other things. An X-Acto knife. You're going to need this to cut out certain parts of the graphic once you lay it on, like around the door edges and in certain places where there are gaps. You know, the gas cover where there's a little, so that it can actually pop out. So X-Acto knife becomes important, but one of the key things we also learned is that you do not want to cut on an actual customer's vehicle. And because we want to make sure that we can still do that, we're going to use what's called knifeless tape, and that's by 3M. And that's this stuff right here. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to make cuts where we would have to cut directly over the paint job, but we don't want to because we don't want to cut into the vehicle. Very handy. We're also going to use this particular cutter, which is a device that allows us to cut across any of the vinyl without having scissors. And it doesn't necessarily allow for the straightest edge. I mean, it can if you're very quick or very straight when you do this, but in certain areas, it's going to be hard to cut that vinyl with scissors. But with that said in mind, I still like having myself a pair of nice steel scissors because making curves with that particular device won't work. And so if you have to cut something and you have to cut on a curve to make it fit or arrange when you're doing a rap, scissors do become one of those things that you want to have. Next on that list is going to be what we call a weaver. And a weaver is good because you're going to have to take off certain areas with your weaver. And what it does is it helps you grab that edge. You see how I just grabbed it right there? It allows you to grab instead of trying to fumble around with it and not being able to get it up off the surface. So weaver, very important when you're going to lay out these graphics. Pen and paper. Now I know you're thinking, what does this have to do with a rap? Well, one of the things you're going to notice when we do part 3 is that we're going to be going off of measurements. And we had to make several different measurements as we were going through this because there's certain areas where we want to make sure graphics lay so that they're not interfered with by where the gas cover would be or where a door handle would be. We don't want things to look awkward. So things had to be measured out. And paper and pen, write it down, measure twice. So those are a couple things right there. One of the last things is going to be our heat gun. And this is definitely important because we're going to need to make sure that we flex this particular material as much as possible, and we're going to want to, lay it on there and secure it to the actual vehicle. And so a heat gun becomes important. One of the things that our instructor did show us is that you can use a regular blow dryer. Will I recommend that? I don't know. That's kind of up to you. That's your thing if that's what you want to do. We're going to use a heat gun. I did also buy some extra magnets. And these particular magnets, they do the same thing, but they're not quite as strong. I mean, they're still strong. They're going to hold anything that we put up there. But I kind of wanted to balance in between the two, because if the other magnets are too strong, I don't want to leave permanent circle imprints in our particular graphic. Last thing I wanted to show you, they allowed us to take some of the graphics that were left over from when we did the class. And I took this particular graphic for a couple different reasons. One, it was small enough to kind of play with and work around, but the biggest reason is you look at and you see all these little dots that are going over here. These are called registration marks, and this goes more into the production part of it. But once we print this and we lay a laminate over it, in order to cut our graphic out, it's going to have to be able to read it, and we're going to have to use dots, which are registration marks, so that our particular image is recognizable by the machine when we feed it back through, and it will cut it. So very important, as you can see. These are things that you want to be aware of, that you may not know or may not be told as far as how graphics are pretty much laid out. They go in several different stages, and we'll get into that once we get into our part of our video of part 3. Like I said, I just wanted to go over this particular stuff so that you had an idea of what's being used, because we're not going to really go into explaining that in part 3, because part 3 is more of the application of the wrap, and this is more of the design stage. So with that said, now it's time for us to go ahead and look at what we're designing. All right, thanks for hanging in there with us. We're going to start off with CS6 Photoshop, and we're going to design our initial layout in this particular program. One, because it's a little easier as far as doing some of the effects that we want to make sure that we see, and two, it just makes it easier because we're going to start with photographs. Okay, and I changed this background to a black background because we're going to work on top of a white car. Now, I did photograph this car myself instead of using like a design template of the car, and that's just because I had to do real life measurements and wanted to get an accurate view of what this was going to look like. So we're bringing in our cars that I photographed here, and as you can see, we have driver's side, passenger side, front and rear. Now we're only going to really focus on designing one side of this, because after that things will become redundant, and I don't want to waste your time. So designing this particular vehicle, this vehicle is actually a vehicle I bought for a purpose of being able to promote myself. And so the wrap that we lay across this is actually going to be for my company. And I had to think really hard about what I was going to do to this particular wrap, because I wanted to show that I was an artist and that I could design, and that I was the go-to person if people were looking to have certain graphics done. With that said, originally I wanted to do like illustrations of like comic characters that were my own, or some type of art that was just dramatic going across it that would make people look, and I realized that it didn't tell people who I was and what I did. So I wanted to be creative and bring things more to simplistic as far as what the message is that I'm trying to communicate, because anytime you put a graphic on a particular vehicle, you're communicating a message. So with that said, this is what I came up with. And before we get into that, let me explain the layout. Anytime that you are going to lay out a vehicle, you have to understand that you're going to have to cut things to fit. And so the area that we're going to pretty much measure from is going to be this front part of the door to the rear end bumper. And I didn't want to do the front of the car because it just wasn't necessary for the design that I put in. So I started with a rectangular shape that went straight across the car. Now I'm going to give measurements in this later on in this, but for the design purpose, I just needed a square that went from the bottom top of the windows to the bottom part of the car, from the front part of the door to the rear. And I'll give the sizes in this here in a few. Okay, so with that said, I created this, and then the object was to design on top of it. And once I designed on top of it, I had to create a cutout of it, and I also put a fade in it, and we will bring that up right here. Okay, so now we have it where I put a fade in it. It's going to fade from a light blue, or from white to a light blue, to a darker blue. And I've cut out the handles, I've cut out the tires and the rear light here, because all this stuff is going to have to show on the vehicle, and I'm not going to wrap my door handles. I decided that that would just be a little too much work to go in there and try to cover a door handle that's going to be touched frequently. I just felt it was a bad breakdown for the wrap, and I wanted it to blend out, so this area right here is actually going to be white. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and zoom in, and we can have a better look at what we're designing here. So the artistic part of me wanted to create something that was unique and would stand out when people were looking at it, and I thought of this idea of an arm coming out of the vehicle, punching its way out and drawing across the back of the vehicle. And so with that said, this is what I came up with. And what it entailed was some drawing on top of, I took a picture of my hand holding one of my Cintiq drawing pens, and I had to draw a top across it to make it more clear, is what I want to say, more graphic wise, so that way when we blew it up, it wouldn't lose any resolution. So and then I also wanted to add an element of shock, where it's like this robotic Terminator type arm with wires coming out of it, kind of like the car itself has grown arms and come to life, and it's drawn across it. And so I wanted to do that, so I did it like it was punching out of the metal, and also I added a shadow so that it would give more of a 3D effect. From there, the best thing for me to do was to figure out where the type and all the designs were going to lay. And as you can see, we have a handle here, we have a light here, we have another handle here, and these are all elements that you have to work around. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is when you go on the other side of the car, you still have to work around these elements, but where the text is going to sit has to change, because we read from right to left. And so the text won't sit in the same direct area. So you have to keep in mind that a lot of times stuff that's on one side of the vehicle will have to turn and change slightly to fit the other side of the vehicle properly. But we're not going to go too much into that part of it. What we're going to go ahead and do now is we're going to start and add in our text. And the first part we wanted to do is we wanted to get our message across. And we'll start here. Need a graphic designer. Now, as you can see, I'm very careful about where I put this stuff at. And this stuff is important because when we do our measurements, we're going to measure from the light to the door handle, and then in between both of these, because I have to make sure that when I run this, everything will line up where we're going to cut out for the door handles and where we're going to cut out for where the tail light is. And so our measurements become important when we do that, but we'll explain that as we go along, because I do a totally separate layout for that particular part. So that way we know what's going on. And let's add in some of our other important information. Website is always good, and phone number is always good. All right, now I had a couple graphics because we wanted to act like, you know, we're creating something on this, and this is where we started creating the graphics that are going to show when we are driving down the way. Now, I kind of felt like, man, this is really simplistic, I wanted to have more of a graphic colors and things flying across it. But I think the most important thing that you have to keep in mind when you're doing stuff like this is the simplicity in getting the message across. If I made it too colorful or too busy, people might lose the message. And I'm trying to promote myself, so I don't want them to forget who I am or lose track of what the message actually is. And so because of that, it was very apparent that I needed to get that message across. Now, one of the things that you don't see here is going to be where this gas tank is. And that's not too much of an issue. We just cut around. And if I lighten up the transparency on our actual fade here, you'll still see that it does not interfere with the design. And I'm just going to lighten it up so that you can see. We're still going to see where everything, all the letters are. The biggest thing we had to be concerned about was how close it was to the door handle and how close it was to the light. And we made measurements just for that. Okay, so the other thing I also wanted to promote, on top of the fact that getting them aware and letting them know what the website is and the contact number, was also my social media plugs. A lot of times people want to check you out on other social media platforms, so we went ahead and put those in. And oh, okay, yep, there we go. There's one there. And we're just going to add all these in here. IG and of course the infamous. Okay, so we're getting a clear message across, and the last thing we're going to add is our company logo. Blamo. All right, so this is our vehicle layout that we're going to pretty much do, and we're going to duplicate the same thing on the other side, but everything has to go in the reverse. And so I do want to just bring in one part of this so you can see how that goes, which is just going to be the arm here. And we're going to fit everything in a similar fashion, but you have to keep in mind now design can't be all the way towards the back because of how it sits. So we're going to have a different, slightly different layout on the other side. But everything has to be done in the reverse. And so you're going to have two different layouts. Unfortunately, you can't just take one and flip it and it's going to solve your problem, because it doesn't in this particular case because of how we read and how we do certain things. So in this particular case, as you can see, we're going to have some adjustments to deal with. But our measurements are going to go from front of the door to the back of the rear in both cases. And it's just going to be an adjustment of where we put the actual graphics at and how they lay out. And you know, it's not very complicated, but it is one of those things that you have to keep in mind. Unfortunately, you just can't repeat the same pattern. And from there, the next thing that I kind of wanted to get into and show you is how we go about doing our measurements. And for that, I am going to go into our Illustrator here, and this is where I'm going to tell you about our measurements. Okay, so from front of the door to the rear of the car, which is what this design is primarily laying out, it is 2 feet 6 inches. No, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. It is 10 feet 6 inches, or 126 inches. Now, the reason why I had to measure really in inches is because my settings in the computer aren't set for feet, and inches is set for inches. So it's 126 inches from the front of the door to the rear of the car. From the top to the bottom is 2 feet 6 inches, or just 30 inches. And so that's what this square represents. It represents the distance and the height of where we're going to design. Now, these other blue lines, and as you can see, I have my ruler out here. These other design lines that you see in here that are in the blue or the turquoise color are because we have graphics that go in between here. So as when you look at our original design, our arm goes here. We have text that needs to make sure it doesn't run into the door handle or the light. And so we had to be able to line all those things up. And so we did a measurement from door handle to front door. We did a measurement for our rear light to handle. So from here to here, and then from here to here, because this is generally where all our stuff is going to land, and we want to make sure that we miss all these particular areas. So we have to know exactly how much space we're dealing with. And between these two spaces here, we have, see here, 2 feet 5 inches or 32 inches altogether. And back here we have 1 feet 10 inches or 22 inches altogether. And so when we go in and we lay in our graphics, we're going to make sure that all this stuff fits right here. That way when we print it, we're not surprised. I'll also have a little bit of a overflow on some of this, and as you can see, that's why it kind of goes up, just because we want to have enough room to make adjustments. The other thing is our machine is not the largest printer in Roland's brand. We use a BN20, which is a pretty small machine for doing this, so this will have to be broken up in 2 different sheets. But I want to try to get from here to here, which is where that I want to put the seam map for the second piece. If not, it's going to be really close. It's going to be in this area because we are dealing with 30 inches of material that needs to go from top to bottom, and our machine is only going to lay out close to 19. So with that said, there is going to be about I think it's about 8-9 inches that we're gonna have to compensate for in this area. Yeah, it's gonna be about 9 inches in this area. So I don't have a measurement for where that's going to be because I also have to do some overlay with the seams, but that part we'll do more in the production area. But I did want to give you a look at what we were doing there, and we bring it back. So this is what I plan for the overall to look like. I haven't made a choice on whether or not I'm going to do the back of the vehicle. I probably will, but it may just be text. Because originally I had plans to wrap the entire vehicle, but after thinking about what was most important on the message, I decided that, you know what, it's not necessary to wrap a whole vehicle, and in a lot of cases it's not. You see a lot of vehicles being wrapped completely, and it's cool and it looks good, but I think you have to take it a case by case situation, which is, one, the more material, this material is expensive, even for a person that has the machinery and orders wholesale. It's still expensive, and you don't want to waste any of this material. And if this material is not what's going to be visual to the eye for the graphics for people to see, then it's not a necessary graphic. And most people see the sides of your vehicle very clear and the rear. Even when it comes to the front, I'm probably going to lay the logo on there, but I may not do much more than that because most people, because of the angle of this, can't read exactly what your hood is saying. And unless you have a graphic that covers from the hood to the bumper and has some kind of way of showing what image you want, this area too may not be the best area for you to start laying a graphic over. And so that just kind of shows you like what's important. So we know the sides of the car and the rear of the car are going to be the easiest for people to see, and that's pretty much what I'm going to focus on when we do this wrap. So this is going to be more of a partial wrap and not a full wrap, and most of your business is probably going to be that same way. Anytime I've laid graphics on vehicles, I don't typically do a whole wrap. It's always partial or graphics that are laid in certain areas. So with that said, we will conclude this particular part of our wrap part 2, and the next part you're going to see is part 3, where we do the installation. So I hope that you kind of learned some things on how we lay things out. Like I said, this is all done in Photoshop, when we do our measurements and our final layout that's done in Illustrator, because we're going to print from a PDF from Illustrator file. So with that said, I will see you in the next video. Please subscribe so that we can blow up this channel. Have a good day.